The story of the Nigerian Civil War begins before Nigeria's independence, but its spark and the terrible fire that followed are rooted in the immediate post-colonial politics of ethnicity, military power, regional rivalry, and the fear of annihilation. When Britain granted Nigeria independence in 1960, the new country was, in practice, a federation of very different peoples, regions, and economies welded together under one flag. The three largest groups were the Hausa Fulani in the north, the Yoruba in the west, and the Igbo in the southeast. But there were many other ethnicities and smaller identities. Under colonial rule, the British had administered these regions differently, and patterns of education, commerce, and access to power varied sharply from region to region. By independence, the regions had strong political parties and rivalries. The Northern People's Congress dominated the north. The National Council of Nigerian Citizens and Action Group were powerful in the West, and the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons and other groups held sway in the East. Competition for federal offices, access to resources, especially after oil began to matter, and control of the state's institutions made politics brittle. Corruption, real and perceived, and unequal development sharpened resentments. The immediate chain of events that led to civil war unfolded in 1966, a year of rapid and traumatic change. On the 15th of January in 1966, a group of mostly young army officers, many of them Igbo, launched a coup d'etat. The coup assassinated Prime Minister Tafawa Balewa, several senior northern and western politicians, and some military officers. The putschists claimed they were cleaning up corruption and maladministration. The coup failed to install stable civilian rule, but it did create a vacuum. Major General Johnson Aguiyi Ironsi, an Igbo officer and the senior surviving military figure, assumed power as head of state. Many Northerners feared the coup was an Igbo coup intended to dominate Nigeria. Resentment and fear deepened. On 29 July 1966, a counter-coup, led by Northern officers, overthrew Aguiyi Ironsi. Aguiyi Ironsi was killed, and Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon, a Northerner originally from the Middle Belt and seen as a compromise figure, became head of the military government. Between the January and July coups, and especially after the July counter-coup, tens of thousands of Igbo civilians resident in the north were attacked in appalling communal violence and pogroms. Homes were burned, people were murdered, and many Igbo fled en masse back to the eastern region. Estimates of the number killed in these massacres vary. Scholars give figures ranging from the low thousands to many tens of thousands. But the effect was terrifying and decisive. A large population felt they had been targeted on the basis of ethnicity and would not be safe inside a united Nigeria ruled from the center. These events radicalized Eastern leaders and ordinary people alike. Military officers and politicians in the East accused the federal authorities of failing to protect Igbo lives and of complicity. Many saw secession as the only guarantee of safety. In early 1967, tensions intensified. The federal government, worried by the breakdown of order and the possibility of a slide into full civil chaos, tried to reassert control. The eastern region, under Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, the military governor of the eastern region and an Igbo, felt increasingly insecure. In January 1967, senior military and civilian leaders from the regions met in Aburi, Ghana, to seek a compromise. The Aburi Accord, reached in principle, sought to devolve significant powers to the regions, but interpretation of the agreement later became a major dispute. The federal government and many northern leaders back in Lagos read the Aburi wording differently from Ojukwu and eastern leaders. The political trust needed to implement any broad decentralization was absent. Another layer was control of territory and revenues. Oil discoveries in the Niger Delta and the Port Harcourt-Calabar area bordering the eastern region made the stakes existential. Who controlled oil fields and ports controlled huge revenue streams. The eastern region feared that losing access to oil revenue or being deprived of control over territory would leave the Igbo politically and economically vulnerable. Competing claims in mid-1967 over where regional boundaries lay whether certain provinces would be split off to form new regions, and how revenue would be shared, set the stage for a confrontation. On the 30th of May 1967, Lieutenant Colonel Odumegwu Ojukwu declared the independence of the Republic of Biafra, proclaiming the secession of the eastern provinces as a new sovereign state. He argued secession was necessary to protect the lives and rights of the Igbo. To many in the East, it was the only remaining option after massacres and the breakdown of trust. The federal government in Lagos, led by General Gowon, refused to accept secession. From the federal view, the integrity of Nigeria had to be preserved. Allowing secession would set a precedent and likely destroy the federation. The two sides thus entered an unavoidable conflict of principle and power. The military contest began to unfold quickly. The federal government imposed a blockade on Biafra, land, sea, and air restrictions intended to cut off the new republic from supplies and to force a collapse without necessarily engaging every battle. The federal forces were larger, better supplied, and received backing from Britain, which supplied weapons, advisors, and logistical support, and from other international partners. Biafra, by contrast, was a smaller state with limited international recognition and resources. It consolidated support among Igbo civilians and some other minorities in the region. Fighting spread across the contested borderlands. There were clashes for strategic towns, control of roads, airfields, and ports. The Federal Navy and Air Force sought to isolate Biafra, while Biafran forces tried to hold territory and win international sympathy. Within the war, there were conventional set-piece battles, rapid advances, and also extended sieges. What made the Biafran War notorious worldwide was the human catastrophe created by the blockade. Biafra's civilian population, already traumatized by massacres and displacement, faced severe shortages of food, medicine, and fuel. By the middle and late stages of the war, large parts of the eastern population were suffering mass malnutrition. Images of starving children and families were broadcast around the world and became a searing symbol of the war's human cost. The famine, a direct consequence of the blockade, destruction of farms and supply lines, and population displacement, led to estimates of civilian deaths which vary but are commonly given in the hundreds of thousands to the low millions. Many scholars place the death toll, including deaths from malnutrition and disease, roughly between 1 and 2 million, though precise figures are debated. The humanitarian crisis triggered an unprecedented international relief response. Charities, church groups, and private organizations organized massive airlifts of food and medical supplies into Biafra, the Biafran airlift, and international NGOs raised awareness and funds. The scale of civilian suffering made the conflict a global moral and media issue. In many countries, public opinion pushed governments to reassess their positions. Most countries, however, treated the war as an internal Nigerian affair. Britain and the Soviet Union provided the federal government with military assistance. France, some African nations, and others were more sympathetic, publicly or privately, to Biafra. A few countries, including Tanzania and Gabon at times, and some non-state actors expressed support for Biafran independence. Realpolitik and oil politics shaped many governments' choices. Britain's support for the federal side was crucial. London had long-standing ties to Nigeria and strategic interests there, and actively supplied military material. The United States was officially neutral but maintained close relations with the federal government. France provided covert assistance to Biafra at times. The result was a partial internationalization. Weapons and logistics flowed to the federal side, while moral and humanitarian support buoyed Biafra. The fighting had several phases: early border clashes and maneuvers, federal offensives to capture strategic towns and ports, Biafran counterattacks, and finally sustained federal campaigns that cut off Biafran ports and isolated the territory. Some noteworthy military elements: Biafran leadership. Odumegwu Ojukwu was the emblematic leader, combative, charismatic, and determined. His administration tried to run a government under siege. Biafran military, made up of former Nigerian army officers who sided with Biafra, local recruits, and innovative tactics. Biafra attempted to arm itself by airlifts, local production, and limited foreign purchase. Federal leadership. General Yakubu Gowon led the federal state with a military command that included several senior officers. Some federal commanders, for instance Colonel Benjamin Adekunle, nicknamed Black Scorpion, leader of the Riverine and Marine Commando forces in the Niger Delta, became prominent for their roles in the campaign to recapture coastal and riverine areas. Key federal strategy: capture of port cities to enforce the blockade and eliminate Biafra's export-import capacities, and taking control of main roads and airfields. By 1968, federal forces made major gains. The fall of important towns and ports reduced Biafra's ability to import supplies. The loss of seaports and control over coastal areas intensified the famine and made Biafra's military position unsustainable. Inside Biafra, the civilian population coped with rationing, improvised farming schemes, and makeshift medical care. Entire communities were displaced. The Biafran government tried to organize relief, but the shortage of fuel, medicines, and food limited what it could do. Biafran social life became defined by survival. The war also created social fractures. Some ethnic minorities within the secessionist territory were uncertain or opposed to secession. Others supported Biafra. Boko, not relevant. Many non-Igbo minorities in the oil areas had complex relations with both sides. Women, children, and the elderly bore much of the suffering. Reports of disease, malnutrition, and mortality were widespread. International journalists' photographs of emaciated children galvanized world public opinion and drew attention to the conflict as not only a political struggle but a moral crisis. Through the war, there were occasional ceasefires and talks, but talks failed repeatedly because both sides saw different stakes. The federal government insisted on Nigerian unity. Biafra insisted on sovereignty as the only guarantor of Igbo survival. The Aburi Accord earlier in 1967 had shown how fragile agreements were when interpreted differently. By late 1969 and early 1970, Biafra was a shadow of its early, if embattled, self. Military defeats, the collapse of supply lines, and the enormous humanitarian toll left Biafra politically and militarily exhausted. On the 15th of January 1970, Major General Philip Effiong, Biafra's acting head of state in Ojukwu's absence, announced the formal surrender of Biafra to the federal government. Ojukwu, who had earlier fled into exile in Ivory Coast, issued a message asking Biafran soldiers to lay down their arms. The conditions of surrender emphasized the need to avoid reprisals. The federal government, under Gowon, announced a policy of no victor, no vanquished, and declared an amnesty for former Biafran combatants. In practice, reconciliation was uneven and the scars of the war long-lasting. The human cost remains the most tragic legacy. Accurate casualty counts remain contested, but most credible estimates put the total deaths, military and civilian, direct and indirect from famine and disease, in the hundreds of thousands to around 1 to 2 million range. The famine and disease that followed the blockade accounted for a very large share of civilian deaths. Millions of people were displaced internally or forced to flee. Towns and villages were destroyed or depopulated. Farmland lay fallow. Economically, the war was disastrous. Infrastructure was ruined, oil production disrupted, and a generation's productive capacity was lost or damaged. Gowon's government attempted to reunify Nigeria. The "no victor, no vanquished" slogan became the official rhetoric. The government set up reconstruction and rehabilitation programs and launched plans for reintegration. The military regime restructured Nigeria's regions into 12 states to reduce the power of the old federal units and to try to undercut secessionist impulses. Many wartime grievances, however, were not fully addressed. Political marginalization, economic inequalities, and ethnic distrust lingered. Many Igbos who had been displaced or returned to other parts of Nigeria reported discrimination in employment and public life following the war. The eastern region bore both the brunt of wartime devastation and the long road to reconstruction. The Nigerian Civil War remains one of the most painful events in modern Nigerian history. It sparked debates about identity, citizenship, the rights of minorities, the distribution of oil wealth, and the role of the military in politics. For many Igbos, the war is a defining trauma, loss of life, property, and a sense of security. For many Nigerians outside the East, the war remains a reminder of the dangers of secession and the fragility of post-colonial states. Historians continue to debate responsibility. Some place primary blame on military actors and politicians who failed to protect civilians and to manage the political transition. Others emphasize systemic colonial legacies that left Nigeria unreconciled across regions. Others stress the immediate responsibility of those who perpetrated massacres in 1966 and the federal responses that escalated to blockade and military force. The truth is complex and involves shared responsibility at multiple levels: local violence, regional mistrust, political miscalculation, economic competition, and international responses that privileged geopolitical interests over immediate human needs. What the war changed. Politically, Nigeria emerged reunited but altered. The state was more centralized in some ways, and military rule remained in power for many years after the war. The restructuring into states changed the political map. Economically, the war damaged the Eastern economy. Oil politics were forever altered as control and revenue became even more central to federal calculations. Socially, deep mistrust between communities lingered. Millions who survived the war had to rebuild lives from trauma. Internationally, the war exposed limits of international law and humanitarian response to internal conflicts, and it created a model for international NGO relief operations in later crises. Some key names to remember: Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, military governor of the Eastern Region, leader of the Republic of Biafra; Yakubu Gowon, head of the Nigerian federal government and de facto leader during the war; Johnson Agui Ironsi, head of state after the January 1966 coup, assassinated in the July counter-coup; Philip Effiong, Biafran officer who signed the formal surrender in January 1970; Benjamin Adekunle, federal commander identified with campaigns in the Niger Delta, notable controversial figure;